And they exemplify, therefore, the great power that science fiction has always had to project ourselves beyond what we know and to exploit any what-if, be it scientific, social, moral, whatever, and to push that. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today, one scientific concept, two novels. One idea, one scientific theory, two completely different novels using the same idea. Today we want to talk about Suzette Elgin's novel, Native Tongue, from 1984. And we want to talk about the novel by Jack Vance from 1958 called The Languages of Pow. Now, Suzette Elgin was a professor of linguistics, an American professor of linguistics. She wrote Native Tongue, and she wrote two more novels after that in the same sort of series and world, as it were. She was a poet, she was a feminist, she invented a language which is relevant for today. And Jack Vance needs little introduction when it comes to science fiction and fantasy. He's one of the biggest names in the 20th century, sort of fantasy especially, and science fiction. Enormous output, lots of prizes, Hall of Fame of science fiction, and some detective novels as well, in fact. Now, very, very briefly, what those two novels are, because the plot here doesn't really matter, and what happens throughout the novels, in a way, matters a lot less than what they're doing with that scientific idea we'll talk about in a minute. Very, very briefly, in Jack Vance, The Languages of Pow, there's a planet with sort of very equal-humored, placid, non-violent, non-enterprising people. And for different reasons, a decision is made to create three new languages in relation to three groups to try and make that planet productive, as it were, and more enterprising. It was thought that the best way to get those people to change was to create languages for them to change accordingly. And so you have three groups of people who have different tasks, management tasks, sort of manual, go-getter type of class, etc. And for each of them, a language is created, and babies, when they are born, are separated in three groups, and each group learns one language that is dedicated to giving them the tools, the cognitive, intellectual tools, to achieve what it is that their class of people is supposed to achieve. In Suzette Elgin's Native Tongue, we're sometime in the future, and it's of course reminiscent of a now very famous book, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. The amendment in the American Constitution concerning the rights, the equal right of women, was repealed, and so women are now second-class citizens or third, fourth-class citizens. They are little more than not servants exactly, but mothers. They have no voice, no power of decision, no power of influence. They're not listened to. They are treated like children. And when women have gone over the age of reproduction, as it were, fertility, they are basically sent to some big houses where they live together away from the world of men. Now, those two novels, even though they are very different stylistically, they're very different in terms of setting, they're very different in terms even of type of science fiction that they sort of handle. They both rely on the same idea. Now, we need to explain this idea very quickly. It's a very famous hypothesis in linguistics, in the science of language. It's called the Sapir and Whorf hypothesis. And basically, very simplistically, because it's a much debated issue in linguistics, very simplistically, the Sapir and Whorf hypothesis says that, or asks the question, whether the language you speak influences the way you can perceive the world, relate to the world, influences cognition. So basically the idea is, does the language you speak inherently limit what it is that you can see or describe or even think about, conceptualize, perceive and conceptualize? It's a very hotly debated topic in linguistics. It's related to linguistic determinism and different questions, basically to do with the interaction between cognition and language and the role of language in molding, shaping cognition. Now, this theory is from the 1950s, more or less, and as you can see now, Jack Vance uses that idea that language determines your relationship with reality around you, with the world around you. He uses that idea because he says, if we want to have very enterprising people who want to go and do things, then we need to create a language which in its verbs, in its grammar, in its vocabulary, in its syntax, will make those people think in this enterprising way. If we want people to think in the abstract, to do research, to find, uncover, discover new technological tools, new theories to do with whatever in the world, then if we give those people a language that shapes the thinking so that those people have no choice really but want to find, want to investigate, want to research and can think in the abstract, that is, of course, the theory of Sapir and Whorf. Now, alternatively, you have a later take, which is Suzette Elgin's take on it, Native Tongue, 1984. And in her society, once women find themselves living in those big houses, together, away from the world of man, they start thinking, okay, what is it that the language we use, what kind of influence does the language we use have on the way we can express ourselves as women? Now, that was a very, very hot topic in the 70s and 80s in the feminist theoretical movement that arose in those decades. And one of the ideas was that historically, culturally, language has been shaped by men, both in terms of writing and therefore exposition to learning, because predominantly it was a man's business, and of course in any position of power where language plays a very strong role, the judicial world, for example. And here again, historically, culturally, language was shaped and dominated by men. So that those feminist theories in the 70s, 80s asked the question, well, if that is the case, and if we think that men and women are not exactly alike, could it mean that there are things that women cannot express because they are exclusively female perceptions, but because the language is male or male-dominated, it does not contain the words or the grammar to express those women's perceptions? That is the idea that Suzette Elgin uses in her novel, because those women in those big houses, they will start developing their own language, a language that is a female language, a women's language. And of course, that language will enable those women to express ideas, feelings that are simply not expressible by a male-dominated language. And that is what those two novels actually do. They use the same theoretical concept, the Sapir and Whorf hypothesis, but both of them do something completely different with it. Now, of course, I don't want to spoil your pleasure in reading those two novels, even though they may not be the best novels ever written, as pieces of literature using one theoretical concept to explore the what-if, speculative question that science fiction loves and is great at. This is really the main interest in those two books. Now, of course, there is always a danger in books like these in falling a little bit short of, let's say, narrative quality, because, for example, they are too preoccupied with explaining the theory. So do not be afraid, because those two books really do not do that. They don't spend endless pages explaining the theory. They never refer to that theory, they never refer to that name or anything. They really give you exactly what you need throughout the novel to basically make it clear what they're trying to do. And there is no need to have background in linguistics or to know anything about linguistics to actually be able to understand perfectly well what those two novels do. This is very often, of course, a pitfall for novels inspired by science. It is a pitfall that perhaps you've been exposed to in science fiction, hard science fiction, and Greg Egan can sometimes perhaps be accused of falling a little bit short, narratively speaking, by being too scientific and too preoccupied with explaining the science. And that is, as I'm sure you know, equally a problem in historical fiction very often, when the writer has done so much research that they want to include everything in their novel, and then the novel suffers, of course, enormously. Alternatively, they haven't had the time or the dedication to do enough research, and their 16th century characters speak and think like a 21st century one, which is an equal failure, of course. So there is always a great danger in idea-based novels, and certainly in theory-based novels. But in the case of those two, they manage very well to introduce that main idea, that language shapes your perceptions and the way you relate to the world. And they are novels in their own right, and they work as novels as well in their own right. What they both also exemplify, of course, is the degree to which science fiction doesn't need to speculate about future developments. Science fiction can also use science, existing science as it were, or scientific inquiry, to develop a what-if. Now, let's imagine that what we have recently discovered applies throughout, or is true and provable. Then what could be the effect in the long term? What could be the meaning in the long term? What could be the effect on our understanding of ourselves, etc. And that is, of course, what science fiction is great at. And the ideas used, or the main idea used in those two novels, exemplify that very well, because Suzette Elgin, with her background as a linguist, again, it's not heavy at all in the book, so it doesn't come across as if she's a linguist herself. But using that background, she asked questions which were very much asked at the time of writing that novel, and questions which are still very relevant today when you consider that a lot of people still believe that there are inherently a great deal of differences between men and women. Well, if that is true, and if language does have an influence in the way you can express or what you can express, then of course the question can be asked, well, we only have one language for two supposedly different genders. What does that mean about the expression of inherently gender-specific feelings or perceptions, of course? This work of Sapir and Whorf was research in areas like color perception. If you don't have a word for a specific color, can you see that color? It was applied to time, expression of time and relation with time, space, for example. And in all those domains, some, let's say, slight to noticeable effects were observed that yes, when the language is absent, in counting, for example, arithmetic, it does seem to have an influence on the perception of quantities, for example. The same is true of colors, the same is true of time, and it's still a heavily debated topic. So it is perfectly natural that somebody would seize on that question and say, well, what if? What if women, in a world where they have no right, find themselves together and start evolving their own way of speaking? What would that be? Now, of course, Suzette Elgin cannot really give us examples of what that eventually is in a novel, for obvious reasons that such a language has not yet been developed. of course, there was a women-specific language in Japan, for example, until the Second World War, but that's not quite the same. There are gender-specific languages in the world, obviously, but that's very often more to do with taboo words that one is not allowed to use, for example, depending on the gender you belong to. So, but this question remains still very true today. Jack Vance's take on it, which you will see at the end of the novel, is obviously, I think, carrying a sort of social message. Perhaps it will be for you, of course, to decide. You can leave a comment to let me know what you thought. But Jack Vance takes the opposite direction, which is, well, what if he created a language for one specific way of seeing the world, for one specific way of thinking about the world? And if we had babies educated exclusively in that language from birth, what kind of people would they become? And of course, today that discussion is still very much alive in different terms, perhaps, but it's about the specialization, hyper-specialization of people. If you're hyper-specialized in one domain, do you know anything about it? Does it matter? Do you need to know anything about it? Do you need to understand how others look at the world if you're hyper-specialized in your own thing and you're very good at it? Education, should it be a general one or very specific, geared towards one specific profession, for example? All those questions are very much alive. The role of language in shaping perceptions, and therefore the role of language in our life in general. So those two novels, those two science fiction novels from different times, with very different intentions, very different settings, very different characters, very different styles as well. Those two novels basically rely on the same idea and exploit that scientific theory in different ways. And they exemplify, therefore, the great power that science fiction has always had to project ourselves beyond what we know and to exploit any what if, be it scientific, social, moral, whatever, and to push that what if to explore what it is that makes us today. Those two books do that as well, and I can only recommend that you go and read them together. Good reading. Thank you.